Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club, where we are reading the book entitled Pioneers Together by Josephine Cunnington Edwards. This book is a biography of Roy F. Cottrell and his wife Myrtie, who were both born in 1878 and led an exciting life of service and mission in the early days of the young and rapidly growing Seventh-day Adventist Church. In our last reading, we covered chapters 10 and 11, when the Cottrells embarked upon their cross-country train ride from New York to California, on which they experienced bitter winter storms and a sudden change in weather and scenery to the summer of California, with its verdant greenery and endless groves of fruit trees. The most unforgettable moment of this trip was a visit with Ellen G. White, who sent them off to their mission with a beautiful prayer. The sea voyage took them through Japan and finally to Shanghai, China, where they began their river voyage to Changsha, the location of their mission station. The work was tough and challenging, since Changsha had been known as the most anti-foreign city in inland China, and while there, they experienced their first taste of a pagan ritual known as the annual dragon procession. The procession, which lasted 3 hours, went right past the mission station, but the missionaries were horrified to see that as the 3-block-long dragon passed, following were 50 priests carrying pots of smoking incense, suspended by cords from rusty needles pierced through their wrists. If this were not bad enough, toward the end of the parade were 2 very young children, about 2 years old, bound securely by an arm and a leg to a long pole. In the terrific heat of the Chinese summer, these 2 young children could not survive, and soon their lifeless bodies were bobbing up and down as the procession continued. The unspeakable terror of paganism and ritual sacrifice increased the missionaries' desire to bring the Word of God to the country. A while later, Myrtie was struck with appendicitis, and after a 40-mile trek on a stretcher, followed by a train ride to a Lutheran hospital almost 150 miles away, and then on to Shanghai for surgery, she finally recovered. With the departure of another missionary family on furlough to the U.S., the Cottrells were transferred to another province to continue their missionary work. We pick up the story today with chapter 12, entitled Lengthening Cords. In the autumn of 1909, 2 years before the first airmail flight, several new missionary families arrived from America. Europe was then growing uneasy over the widening ambitions of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and the Balkan situation was getting touchy. Just recently, the world had been informed that Admiral Peary had, after incredible hardships, reached the North Pole. In China, the mission work was expanding so rapidly that 3 large provinces were being organized into the East China Mission, with headquarters in Shanghai. And Roy was chosen as its first superintendent. This necessitated a move from the interior, which the workers there regretted, but the young Cottrells stood ready to serve wherever they were needed most. After securing a little home convenient to Roy's office, they began to make themselves at home. Then, sad news came from America. Roy's father had fallen asleep in Jesus. It was no great surprise, for he had been in poor health for a long time. But no one is ever really ready to give up loved ones. Even on the other side of the world, Roy and Myrtie sensed the agony of dear Mother Cottrell. Much as he grieved, Roy knew her sorrow was far more crushing. A letter was immediately dispatched, inviting her to come to China and make her home with them. It was a most welcome suggestion. She gladly accepted the invitation, and being with those she loved helped to ease the pain of loneliness. Among the new arrivals at that time were Frederick Lee, only 21 years of age, and his young bride. They had been appointed to locate in the little inland city of Yingshan Hsian, 400 miles northwest of Shanghai. Naturally, the trip should be made by river, for roads in China were far from adequate. A gasoline launch and houseboat were secured for the journey. The Lees were to be accompanied by Dr. H.W. Miller, William A. Westworth, and Roy. The first part of the journey along the famous Grand Canal was easily negotiated, but they ran into difficulty when they arrived at the outlet of the Hengzi Lake. The water there was so dangerously low that they did not dare attempt to cross with the motorboat. Accordingly, Dr. Miller returned to Shanghai with the launch, and the rest of the party continued on their way by houseboat. The journey was a rough one, for the small craft was continually tossed by the high winds. At length, the mission party reached Yingshan Hsian, where they found the Chinese Pastor Han and a company of 14 new believers desiring baptism. So unpopular were foreigners and foreign religions at that time that the pastor feared a disturbance if the baptism were conducted in public. Accordingly, to avoid possible trouble, it was decided to hold the service late at night. The little group of believers waited until all was quiet in the small pagan town. Then they quietly made their way through mud and rain to the river. Even then, the water was so shallow and muddy that Roy had to wade far out into the middle of the stream to find water sufficiently deep. The candidates followed in groups. The last one to be baptized was an old crippled grandmother who was carried into the stream by her son. She looked so old and frail that Roy spoke comfortingly to her. "Sister, do not fear," he said gently. "Certainly not," was the courageous reply. "I am just as safe as if I were in the arms of Jesus." The darkness of that night hid a memorable occasion from the view of the heathen townspeople. Yet, to that little company, all was as bright as though they had been baptized at noonday. The next day, the little group met again, and a church was organized. Though the city was small and the beginning modest, yet from this place in the years that followed, more than 100 workers for God in China went forth. There were literature evangelists, pastors, physicians, and nurses who consecrated their service to the cheerless, sin-sick people of that needy land. Roy and Elder Westworth left the young couple to do their work in Yinshan, and pushed on to the mission station at Ku, where they found welcome letters from home awaiting them. This was the first news they had received in more than 3 weeks from their dear ones or from the great outside world. Arriving at Hankow, Roy found another experience awaiting him, which he was to remember and ponder. He had met many fearful people who nevertheless had an armor of faith and courage which carried them through difficulties. But the young couple he now met were of a different stamp. He accompanied them to Changsha. Whether circumstances looked too forbidding, or whether the mission compound was too cramped, narrow, and dingy, no one ever knew. At any rate, fear and homesickness so overcame them that within a few days they returned to Shanghai. There, they cleverly and secretly devised a speedy getaway to America. Perhaps it was just as well. Those who are unwilling or unable to make sacrifices can never face the stern rigors and realities of frontier mission life. During the next 2 months, Roy was kept busy helping to open 2 new mission stations in East China. One of these was in the important and interesting city of Nanton. At this time, too, Mother Cottrell arrived in China after the long voyage across the Pacific. She was very sad and felt her loss keenly, but the new environment and change in outlook helped her over the hardest part of her bereavement. With Murty, sympathetic and kind, she soon settled down, an important and beloved addition to their household. The family spent a busy yet delightful summer in the refreshing atmosphere of Mogansan, away from the intense heat and bustle of Shanghai. While there, Roy spent every moment possible at his desk, writing a brief history of Seventh-day Adventists for the Mandarin-speaking people of China. Then, like a bolt from the blue, the anti-foreign feeling in Changsha exploded. For 3 days, the city was terrorized by lawless mobs, and all foreign-owned property was vandalized and destroyed. The mission station was looted and badly damaged, and the Lairds, after all the kindly work they had done for the poor and the sick, had to flee for their lives, at length finding refuge in Shanghai. They were so shaken by the horror of the ordeal that their nerves were shattered, and furlough seemed imperative. Now came the question as to who would go into this danger zone and salvage the shattered mission resources in Changsha. No one wanted the task, for facing death is no pleasant experience, even to the most courageous. One day, as the annual committee meeting was about to convene, the president of the Asiatic Division approached Roy and said, "Friend Cottrell, we don't like to disturb you in the good work you're doing in East China, but I have been thinking of the pitiful condition of the work in Changsha. I've thought of all the workers, and you seem to be about the best and the only man available." What a shock to Roy, Murty, and the dear mother. Much was at stake, much to be considered. "Oh no," Roy answered. No. Don't think of me for that place, please. We're just starting the work in several new places in this East China mission." "But who?" pursued the president. "Who besides you could we send?" "But listen," Roy replied in all earnestness and much distress. My widowed mother has just arrived from America to be with us in Shanghai. It would be unthinkable for us to take her to that dingy, wrecked, and unsanitary compound in Changsha. It might even mean her death. But the work must go on, Brother Cottrell. What can we do? Roy continued his protest. You know, Mother is neither strong nor young. At any time there might be another outbreak of violence. We just couldn't dream of placing her in such a situation. I'm sure we can find someone else for that province. But the best of arguments were waved aside, and the committee cast its vote. Roy learned that when the work of God calls, personal convenience and family ties must take second place. When the meeting was over, it was very hard for him to return to Murty and his mother with the news, and harder yet to tell Mother Cottrell that she must pack again and make her way back to California. So another dream was shattered in order that God's work could grow and prosper. Roy and Murty dismantled their home, hauled out the old packing boxes, and started preparations for their trip back to dangerous Changsha and the dingy little mission compound. Some foods were very scarce in Changsha, particularly fruit. And as figs were very plentiful at that time in Shanghai, Murty occupied much of her spare time canning some to take with them. Other missionary wives lent a hand to help her. On the river steamer which was to carry them to Changsha, they placed the cartons of figs underneath their berths in the little stateroom. All went well until the second night of the trip, when a sound like the report of a pistol startled them. One by one, those jars of figs were beginning to ferment and explode. Such a mess they had to clean up. But some things are better faced in high spirits and good humor. Something must have gone wrong, Murty commented. I agree with you, Roy said, scooping up the soured contents from under the berth. He made haste to dispose of this before any of the Chinese could suspect the Adventist missionaries of running a still in connection with their mission work. At the compound in Changsha, everything was as bad as they had feared, or even worse. The mission had been looted and battered. There were great heaps of debris and rubbish to clear away, and partitions, doors, windows, and walls to repair. But the picture had a brighter side. The more sober and sensible of the people remembered the Lairds and their unselfish ministry to the sick and poor. Therefore, when missionaries arrived again, seemingly without fear, and began to clean up, uncomplainingly, the results of the unjust vandalism, the effect upon the Chinese people was wholesome. They were favorably impressed. The anti-foreigner disturbances seemed to have turned the city dwellers toward the gospel instead of against it. New interests were created. A brighter day was dawning for Changsha, and almost immediately a new baptismal class was formed. Before long, this company of believers followed their master in the sacred rites of baptism, and there was much rejoicing when the first Seventh-day Adventist church in Hunan province was organized. Shortly afterward, they arranged an itinerary on the Siang River by houseboat. Roy and Murty took with them their converted language teacher, Honorable Doctrine Yellow, and 3 of the men whom they planned to train as literature evangelists. One of the 3, a man named Dijang Bao Ting, seemed to be a very poor student. He could barely grasp or retain in his mind the vital truths of Scripture. But how true it is that man often looks on the outward appearance, while the Lord is watchful of what is in the heart. It was discouraging, for it seemed that he could never learn even the elementary things necessary to qualify him as a successful literature evangelist. Early one morning, as they traveled, Murty awakened Roy and whispered, "Just listen to that prayer, Roy." From an adjoining stateroom, they could hear Mr. Dijang's voice, pleading with God for strength of mind to understand and remember the words of life. Roy whispered to Murty, "There is hope for a man who can pray like that." Indeed, this promise in the Bible seemed written especially for poor Mr. Dijang. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. James chapter 1, verses 5 and 6. That prayer was remarkably answered. It was surprising the amount of Scripture that Mr. Dijang was able to commit to memory, and he developed into a highly successful soul winner. How true are these words? There is no limit to the usefulness of one who, by putting self aside, makes room for the working of the Holy Spirit upon his heart and lives a life wholly consecrated to God. The Desire of Ages, pages 250 and 251. Entering one city along the route, they came in contact with a Chinese hotel keeper who was favorable to Christianity. He gave the group permission to hold services in his hotel lobby. And at one of these meetings, Roy asked Mr. Huang to give his testimony. Among other things, he said, "People ask me why I keep the seventh-day Sabbath. Let me illustrate. Suppose an esteemed friend will invite you to a feast on the 7th day of the month. Should you go on the 6th day or the 8th day? You would not only miss the feast, but you would show disrespect to the friend who invited you. Now listen, dear friends. The great God, who created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, rested on the 7th day. On this 7th day, he prepares a great spiritual feast for all his people. Some, like our Mohammedan friends, come on the 6th day. Others follow Roman Catholic teachings and come on the 1st day. But all these miss the feast that God has prepared, and also dishonor the Creator of heaven and earth. Today, God invites you to come on the day He has appointed and sit down at the great Sabbath feast." Roy sat listening in amazement. Afterward, he asked Mr. Huang, "Where did you get that wonderful illustration concerning Sabbath keeping?" I don't know," came the reply. "I think the Lord must have given it to me for the occasion." "Well, it certainly was fitting," was Roy's reply. On this trip, the missionaries met Mr. and Mrs. Chuen, meaning complete. They had with them their daughter Ren, 13 years of age. Her name meant grace complete. Murty invited this intelligent girl to come to Changsha, share their home as one of the family, and attend the mission school. The girl's face sparkled with happiness at the opportunity. Months later, when she did arrive, Murty gave her lessons on the organ. She was such a talented student that within 6 months, she was able to play for the mission Sabbath school. This was extraordinary progress for one who had never before had access to an instrument of music. But young Grace Complete loved music so much that she spent many hours in diligent practice. The narrow mission quarters in Changsha had always been inadequate, and now, with new believers crowding in and new students waiting to enroll in the school, the need for a change became imperative. Suitable mission homes were also a necessity. The city of Changsha, literally long sand, was so named because of the long stretches of white sand visible during the low water seasons. The city lies along the east bank of the Siang River, which at this place is about a mile in width. In the middle of the river, and facing the riverfront, is an island some 3 miles in length, averaging 1 or 2 city blocks in width. From an elevation, the island looks like a giant arrow lying at its length in the river. On this island, known as Sui Lo Dijo, were tangerine groves, vegetable gardens, some Chinese homes, and a few foreign residences. It was here, after a long search, that Roy found a plot of land for sale. The plot was on the quiet side of the island and was large enough for 2 mission cottages. The view was magnificent. After living on the dirty, noisy city street in such gloomy quarters, the prospect was delightful and the opportunity providential. But alas, no mission committee was available to approve or disapprove, nor were any mission funds on hand to make the purchase even if it was approved. Roy and Murty were burdened with the pressing needs of a growing mission, and it seemed futile to wait long and anxiously for a letter to go and the reply to return. The land might be sold by that time. The more they looked at this delightful location, the more they set their hearts upon it. The 2 young people prayed earnestly for several days for the Lord to give them wisdom to know what to do. They had a little money of their own, and the price of the desirable lot seemed very reasonable, only $700 in American money. At last, they decided to buy the land themselves and on their own responsibility. Then the mission committee would be in no way bound to take it if they did not approve. Later, at the annual committee meeting, it was with fear and trembling that Roy apprised the brethren of what he had done. On hearing this, the chairman of the Asiatic Division Committee stated with much emphasis, "Brother Cottrell has done a most foolish thing. Why, even the president of the General Conference would not dare to do such a thing without committee action." Roy's spirits sank to zero and congealed. He and Murty had prayed so earnestly for guidance. They had once read that when we give ourselves wholly to God and in our work follow His directions, He makes Himself responsible for its accomplishment. While these thoughts were coursing through Roy's mind, comforting him in his chagrin, the chairman continued. On the other hand, we do need the property in Changsha for mission homes, and it may be that Brother Cottrell has done a smart thing after all. So Roy breathed a sigh and felt better. He had been properly chastised and then commended. But the greatest victory came later. After a few weeks, the division president visited Changsha, and Roy took him to see the site he had purchased for the mission cottages. It was so lovely, quiet, and cool there by the water that he exclaimed over it with pleasure. "Why, Brother Cottrell, this is wonderful! How did you ever secure such a fine property at such a low cost? This is the best site I've seen for mission homes in all China." Everyone was pleased. With the money in hand, they secured a Chinese contractor, and the construction work began. Soon the place was a beehive of industry, with workmen doing their various chores. Foundations were laid, logs were drawn from the river and sawed into boards. To interested onlookers, it appeared as though the Cottrells were setting up a brickyard, a planing mill, and a lumber yard on their plot of land. Often, as many as 100 workmen were employed, some skilled, others unskilled, none earning more than 20 cents a day. The cost of the building was very small in comparison with what it would be today. Yet, the young missionaries seldom felt greater delight than when they saw their new home growing before their eyes. Every day brought obvious progress. The first buildings to be erected on the property were the 2 servants' quarters, each of them about 12 by 20 feet in dimension. As soon as these were finished, Roy and Murty moved their goods from the mission property to occupy one of them. Though far from ideal, this was much more comfortable than the cramped quarters in the city. With the arrival of summer, the heat became oppressive, and Roy came down with a severe attack of jaundice. For many weeks, he was too nauseated to want food or drink. He rapidly lost weight and became unable to work. Murty was deeply concerned, and she did everything she could. Yet she realized more than ever how helpless one can be, isolated and far from help on a small inland China mission station. One Friday evening, after the lights had been extinguished and Murty was preparing to retire, she glanced out of the window and was startled for a moment. A little group of figures, dressed in white, quietly approached the house. But soon, her fears were subdued when she recognized some of the group as members of the church. They gathered around the doorstep and knelt in prayer. One by one, she heard their simple petitions offered in behalf of Roy, that God would heal and restore their Musi shepherd, so that he could continue his work. In the moonlight, it was indeed a beautiful sight. After they had finished, they arose and left as quietly as they had come. Their purpose was not to disturb, but to lay the case of their beloved missionary at the feet of the great physician whom they had learned to trust. Shortly after this, a small British steamer came into the port of Changsha. When it departed, Roy was on board. With applications of ice to his stomach and head, The terrible nausea was quickly relieved, and Roy was able to eat once more and enjoy it. 5 days later, he was able to walk off the boat in Shanghai. His weight was down to a mere 100 pounds, but with excellent care in the hospitable home of Doctors Arthur and Bertha Salmon, he made a rapid recovery. Roy recalls that the food he enjoyed most was the large, delicious, ripe tomatoes that were then in abundance. He could not seem to get enough of them. Doubtless, the rigors of the disease had so weakened his powers of resistance that the wonderful natural vitamin C was just what his system required. Within a few weeks, Roy was back to normal, and the young missionaries were able to return to their happy task in the interior. The end of Chapter 12 of Pioneers Together.